What would you say if I told you that the success of Battlefield 1 is the root of many of the problems with the Battlefield franchise today?
I think it's in there. All right. Let's get it. Hold on. Do you know what that thing could do to you?
Great, now that I have your attention, let me explain. If you're like me, you've been playing Battlefield games for over a decade now. My first game was Battlefield Bad Company 2, and I was completely sucked in by the massive destruction, immersive gameplay, and well-written characters for an FPS game. I remember first watching the scene when Flynn, the helicopter pilot, reveals that he's a pacifist, and Haggart lets out this iconic reply.
Fuck that! That'll fly with me, Space Muffin! I can argue to the goddamn Magic Kingdom! Love you, man! You silly goddamn muffin-headed fucking liberal!
With the current state of the Battlefield franchise, it's hard to not take a step back, look around, and think about how the franchise many of us grew up with has ended up here, with a game that feels like a messy melting pot of features and mechanics from other games that aren't Battlefield. Now, I'm absolutely aware that sometimes we can look back on the past and view things nostalgic to us with rose-tinted glasses, but in this case, I don't think that applies. The period between Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 4 is generally considered to be the peak of Battlefield, even though Battlefield 4 certainly took its sweet time. How did we go from a series of games with love and passion put into them by the developers at DICE to now a game in Battlefield 2042 that is completely tone deaf on what its community wants and feels like a complete cash grab? This is where Battlefield 1 comes in, a game that was so largely successful and introduced so many new fans to the franchise that what the community wanted had never been more skewed. Now, I'm not one much for these video essays. If you're new to my channel, my content is mostly gameplay and teaching people how to play Battlefield, and I have done so for 5 years. But as I find my love for this franchise dying more and more each day, I can't help but look at the big picture and try to figure out where things went wrong. And I keep coming back to Battlefield 1 as that critical point in the timeline. The game itself was wildly successful. It's the most financially successful Battlefield ever made, and for a lot of the game's lifecycle, provided some of my best memories playing Battlefield to this date. It's the game that made me want to start making YouTube videos, and the memories that the game provided me will always have a place in my heart. I still talk to people, friends to this day that I met playing Battlefield 1. Having said that, what DICE and EA chose to take away from the success of Battlefield 1 is why we find ourselves now 5 years later with the franchise on life support. Battlefield 1 was many things: immersive, gritty, unique, graphically impressive. It had a stable launch by Battlefield standards, but it was also excessively casual, and the core design of the game reflected an experience that was meant to be engaging and easy to play, something that you could come home to after a long day's work and have a casual game of Battlefield. And while Battlefield has always been a casual franchise, the previous games in the franchise certainly had stronger elements of difficulty to them, and they catered more towards playing the game frequently to get better at them as opposed to being able to pick up a controller and get some easy kills. We all loathed the little bird pilots that would farm our teams and dance around every small we shot at them in Battlefield 4, but in doing so you would recognize that the helicopter pilot invested many hours in learning their craft and were genuinely good at the game. Compare that to something like the Ilya Muromets in Battlefield 1, in which you could fly the bomber over an operations objective, drop your payload, and wipe half the team with the press of a button. Now, I admit that is a bit of a cherry pick, and that's because it's an instantly recognizable example, but you don't need to look far to find other examples of this casualization of Battlefield. In fact, all you need to do is look up. The Behemoths were the greatest example of casual gameplay in my opinion. Behemoths were advertised as a way for teams to get back into the action if they were losing, a mechanic to change the tide of the game and keep things even and exciting, but the reality was far from that. The Behemoths very rarely actually swung back the balance of the game in favor of the losing side, and for the players on the opposing end of a Behemoth, it just became another thing that could kill you effortlessly. After one too many unavoidable deaths to a battleship or a train, you begin to ask yourself, wait, why is the enemy team being rewarded for losing again? You could say it's to keep things balanced as advertised, but from a more realistic perspective, these behemoths provided two things. One, it provided a source of hope so the team getting beaten wouldn't get discouraged and quit the game, and two, it was an easy source of kills for whoever was lucky enough to operate the vehicle. You could be a sniper sitting in the back of the map going 2-17, get into an airship and go on a 20 kill streak, and just like that, your game has been made and you probably had a good time doing it at the behest of the team that probably won anyways, because again, the behemoths rarely did what they were advertised to do. You can see sprinkles of this type of game design throughout the entire game. If you're having trouble hitting headshots with your sniper rifle, for example, don't get too upset. At certain ranges, you can get a one-shot kill with the sweet spot mechanic, so you don't need to hit headshots anymore like past titles. Having trouble flying? Well, the control schemes have been completely dumbed down to make flying easier for the casual player. Or you could just sit in a mortar artillery truck in the back of the map where nobody can touch you and drop hundreds of kills without even moving. Are you missing your opponent too often in gunfights? Well, suppression is no longer just visual, and you missing your shots will now force your opponents to miss their shots as well if you suppress them enough. Need I go on? Whenever I talk about this topic, I can't help but think of that moment from The Incredibles when Syndrome says, "If everybody's super, nobody will be." Looking back on it, it felt very much so like Battlefield 1 was designed to try and make sure that everyone had their moment to shine and have a good time doing so. Therefore, no one will have a bad time and churn would be minimized. Battlefield 1 was also released at the perfect time and had some of the most masterful marketing I have seen in the last decade. It was released in a time in which Call of Duty was on a down year in public perception, and players were starting to feel bored with modern military shooters. Battlefield 1's World War I setting was intriguing, it was fresh, it was very fleshed out in terms of its tone and presentation, and it was aimed at those who felt the first-person shooter genre was getting stale. And the thing is, it absolutely worked. The game was fun, it was immersive, it was atmospheric, it was everything that praisers of the game said it was, and that's why a large number of people will come out and say, I don't understand why they just didn't make these more recent games more like Battlefield 1. BF1 achieved what it was meant to, but it didn't come without a cost. As much as Battlefield 1 is responsible for bringing in a large influx of new players to the franchise, it is also responsible for jarring a large chunk of its previously existing player base as well. A lot of people, when looking back on Battlefield 1, don't remember the controversy and the confliction in the community on the new direction of Battlefield. Some players really enjoyed the new direction and enjoyed new players playing the franchise. Others didn't like how casual the game was and how dumbed down it had become, and didn't like that the overarching gameplay design catered to these casual players. It didn't feel like Battlefield. Bet you heard that phrase before. This divide in the player base still affects the Battlefield community to this day. You have the Battlefield veterans that have been playing for decades and are partial to the older titles, and you now also have the newer player base which started playing with Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5. DICE's biggest mistake has been trying to cater to both of them. With Battlefield 5, a lot of my main points in this essay are going to present themselves and make more sense as to where I am going with all of this. Earlier in the video, I said that the takeaways that DICE and EA took from Battlefield 1 are the reasons that the franchise is in the hot water that it is today. That main takeaway is that catering to the larger casual audience can be profitable and successful, and with the right marketing and enough elbow grease, you can pretty much satisfy a majority of your players no matter what you do. The only problem is that with the success of Battlefield 1, fans had developed high expectations and certain expectations for the next Battlefield, expecting it to be a fairly simple evolution of the new gameplay formula. But when it came time to begin development on the next Battlefield title, the outcome of said title was radically different than what any of us ever expected. Instead of evolving from Battlefield 1's gameplay, DICE and EA decided to try and do something else. They decided to chase industry trends and cater to the audiences within those trends, as opposed to making true to form Battlefield games for Battlefield fans. The gaming trends in 2008 were Fortnite, live services with a bunch of cosmetic skins to amplify profits, and battle royales. So you can imagine the surprise when the reveal trailer released and the community that was more or less expecting Battlefield 1 with a World War II setting slapped onto it sees a quippy steampunk-esque World War II title. It was a real what the fuck moment. Why were they going in this direction, people cried. It doesn't make sense. Because Battlefield 1 proved to EA that if you cater to the casual audience and have the right marketing, you can sell anything. It literally just worked for them, not even 2 years earlier with Battlefield 1. But why did it work? Because DICE at the time were genuinely talented developers, and Battlefield 1, despite the controversy within the community and some underlying gameplay flaws, was a damn good video game. It had the marketing, it had the passion behind it, it had the tone and setting, and it was, for most of its life cycle, fun to play. And as history would unfold, Battlefield 5 tried to create the same success as Battlefield 1 had, with new trends to adhere to, and failed masterfully on all fronts. The live service was a boring, drip-fed mess, the game launched in a very buggy state, the marketing of Battlefield 5 was a disaster from the very beginning, and the core gameplay loop can only be summarized as a horrific identity crisis. The gameplay of Battlefield 5 tried too hard to cater to both sides of the community. The gameplay was a Frankenstein's monster of casual mechanics to cater to those familiar with Battlefield 1's gameplay, and some more harsh gameplay mechanics that served only to reinstate the feeling of what older titles were like. And these styles clashed with each other constantly to result in a game that catered to nobody. In turn, Battlefield 5's gameplay was more frustrating than it was fun. Fortifications were a Fortnite ripoff mechanic that rarely contributed to the battle, and truthfully, only served the purpose of giving some lesser players something to do to feel like they contributed. The attrition system was advertised as a mechanic that would entice team play, but instead only encouraged slow gameplay because of how unforgiving it was. And poor visibility didn't help the pace much either. The net result was a gameplay loop that had poor pacing, and deaths felt cheap and unearned due to the attrition system. It was also around this time that the internal strife within DICE began to come into the light. Experienced developers began leaving the company, and Glassdoor reviews from other DICE employees called out the company for having incompetent, stubborn leadership and a toxic work environment, with one review stating, "Creative leadership appears totally clueless. More often than not, their vision raises eyebrows, questions, and concerns. They push their ideas through anyways. Be prepared to work on systems you do not believe in, but leadership is convinced will be a smash hit." Another review states, "The worst part was that it wasn't hard to see why their vision wouldn't work. Leadership was just stubborn and refused to back down or admit that they're wrong, even after negative reception from nearly all parts of the process." Now, Glassdoor reviews should always be taken with a grain of salt, but other testimonies by ex-developers seem to paint a similar picture. I don't claim to know exactly what happened, or exactly how much of this is true, but if I were an experienced DICE developer and I saw the franchise that I had been working on for years heading in an undesirable direction with bad leadership and EA executives at the helm, I would leave the company too, and I imagine a lot of them did. DICE is a studio that very much appears to have leadership that is out of touch and focused purely on their own ideas and visions at the expense of the franchise. This absolutely can be seen in how DICE and EA treated Battlefield 5 post-launch. Multiple time-to-kill changes to reduce player churn despite adamant community feedback that it was not desired or needed, the inclusion of elites that broke the previous promise that everything in the game would be attainable through in-game currency, the removal of fan-favorite game modes such as Frontlines and Domination, the inclusion of Snap Aim Assist on consoles, the cancellation of competitive game modes, and the delay of multiple features such as private servers, and that's the tip of the iceberg. But out of everything, I think the most egregious failure by DICE and EA, when it comes to Battlefield 5 anyways, is how they handled Firestorm. Firestorm was, as you know, Battlefield's Battle Royale, and was the result of EA and DICE once again chasing trends as opposed to innovating and creating Battlefield games as we do them to be. Firestorm, for what it was worth, was not a bad Battle Royale. I actually quite enjoyed it, and thought it had one of the coolest ring designs out of any Battle Royale, but in the big picture, it was not what Battlefield 5 needed. Battlefield 5 launched in a buggy state, and with the game only marginally improving in its stability 4 months into the game's lifecycle, I think many would argue that some of the developers working on Firestorm could have been better suited in helping iron out the bugs in the main multiplayer instead of working on the Battle Royale. On the other hand, Firestorm never really received the support it was promised and the updates that it needed post-launch. With Apex Legends launching the previous month before Firestorm and being free to play, which Firestorm was not, Firestorm died an unfortunate death due to incompetence and lack of resources. It's all extremely unfortunate considering that Battlefield never needed a battle royale to begin with. Whether you thought Firestorm was unnecessary and a waste of resources, or you enjoyed it and watched it flame out due to lack of support and interest, nobody was happy with how Firestorm turned out. Battlefield 5 went on to have a grim, whimpering death, with support being cut on the game a year early, so DICE could focus on making the next game. After trying to chase trends and cater to every demographic with Battlefield 5, one would hope that DICE and EA realized their shortcomings and would go back to creating Battlefield games as we knew them to be. With enough development time, the community hoped that DICE would learn from their mistakes and release a game that was a return to form, not a ripoff of other trends and franchises. Battlefield 2042 admittedly got off to a fantastic start. With hype building and many players hopeful for a rebound from DICE, Battlefield 2042's trailer was a smash hit. 2042 had already succeeded where Battlefield 5 initially failed, the first impression. With multiple different development studios joining on in the effort, it seemed as if 2042 was going to be exactly what the community had been asking for. Unfortunately, that's about the best that 2042 has ever been. As the launch of the game inched closer, the lack of shown gameplay began to concern some players, as DICE had shown nothing but scripted footage and pre-rendered cinematics, including a 15-minute short film to fill in as exposition since there was going to be no single-player campaign. Questions began to flood in as to how far the game really was in development, despite early reports from EA executives that the game was ahead of internal milestones. The beta released in a buggy, disheveled mess, even further calling into question how accurate the reports of the game's development were, and after a month's delay, Battlefield 2042 released in an inexplicably worse state than the beta was in. And here we are in the present, not even 2 full months after the game's releasing, and the player count for 2042 has plummeted drastically, and despite 3 major patch updates, the game is still in an undesirable state. Mouse input is bugged on PC, aim assist is broken on console. A development studio with decades and decades of FPS experience has somehow found a way to not even get the fundamentals of an FPS game working correctly. Tom Henderson made an excellent YouTube video detailing the development timeline for Battlefield 2042, and with the information that he has provided, it seems that once again DICE and mostly EA could not resist chasing the current industry trends and using Battlefield as a conduit to do so, instead of creating a realized grounded experience. Instead of taking the safe route, the route that would have installed trust in the Battlefield franchise if done correctly, EA instead decided to take the greediest option available to them to cater to the larger casual audience. According to Tom, EA wanted DICE leadership to develop the next Battlefield game to include features and mechanics from other popular games at the time, which primarily were Warzone and Apex Legends. The original idea was that the game was going to be a Battle Royale-esque experience with specialists and large open maps. This experience has evolved into what now we know as Hazard Zone. The vision for the game switched halfway through the development cycle to resemble more of a traditional Battlefield title, and DICE had roughly 18 months to create the game from there, and to do so from home due to COVID. Not only were the developers working from home, but some of the developers were woefully inexperienced working on their first Battlefield title, which operates on the notoriously difficult Frostbite engine. That aside, for the second straight title, DICE and EA have elected to chase what is trendy instead of replicating and improving upon what is known to work. It is one thing to be innovative and creative, changing your games to keep things fresh, but adhering to the gameplay that makes your game successful. It is another thing to completely disregard what is known to work and instead chase trends in attempts to cater and envelop a large casual gaming audience, an audience that could care less about how your game does in the long term. And in this case, that casual audience has completely dismissed 2042, and most players have refunded the game or stopped playing. You only need look at the fact that Steam is offering full refunds for the game, and the player numbers for both previous titles are higher than 2042. EA has murdered this franchise, franchise. Battlefield's blood is on their hands, but DICE is holding the knife that did it. They are not faultless in this. The outcome of Battlefield 2042 is an embarrassment to anybody that has loved this franchise at any point in the last 20 years. To say that DICE ended Battlefield 5 support early, killed Battlefront 2 support, and included 3 separate development studios on the development of Battlefield 2042, just to have it still turn out to be this monumental of a flop is nothing short of impressive. With FPS gaming once again entering a depressing stale period, Battlefield 2042 had the opportunity to do incredible things, but instead supplied the greatest choke job in the history of gaming. Specialists have ripped out the traditional class system and serve no other purpose than to be a conduit for microtransactions and cosmetics. The game has released with the least amount of content at launch than any previous Battlefield title. Simple, expected features such as scoreboards, a stat page, and a server browser are inexplicably missing. An experience that is supposed to feel gritty as two nations fight over resources after a worldwide economic collapse instead feels lifeless, boring, and meaningless. 128 players provide nothing but chaos, delivering some of the most frustrating FPS gameplay ever, while also providing the feeling that your performance is completely luck-based. Yet the game still finds a way to be unengaging and feels like nothing you do even matters. The entire project is completely tone-deaf. On the one hand, you have the official Twitter account posting incredible destructive concept art of these maps and lore depicting a world in serious trouble, but in-game, you have a bunch of snarky, happy-go-lucky specialists running around and quipping one-liners on a battlefield that hardly looks like it's even been touched, and having this one annoying motherfucker say, "Don't be sad, this is just how it works out sometimes," at the end of every round. The maps are barren wastelands with no cover, no flow, and no creativity. Hazard Zone was a complete flop, and the portal mode, while cool and exciting for a minute, can only be entertaining for so long, and has been since, unfortunately, abused by players for XP farms to the point where DICE had to shut down XP entirely for a while. Even if Portal was being utilized correctly, it's still content that we have played time and time again, and there is something to be said for a new game's content. The game is just, quite frankly, one of the worst products I've ever played, and if I didn't make content on the game, I would have returned it day one and gotten my money back. Every day I get a comment or someone coming into my stream, a Battlefield fan that has been around for years or somebody that has just bought the game, and they tell me how much they hate this game and how it's already dead. And the more days that pass by, the more I agree with them. Not just the game, but the franchise is dying too. I have watched as the greed of EA has destroyed many development companies and many IPs over the years, most recently Anthem, and it breaks my heart as EA has now seemingly blown the kiss of death on Battlefield as well. That is how we got here. Thank you so much for watching this video, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it despite it not being my usual content. If you enjoyed it, drop a like and leave a comment. If you made it to the end of the video, it helps me tremendously in the algorithm. If you enjoyed it just that much, you should consider subscribing, as I will be making 2042 content moving forward. I stream 4 nights a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday on my Twitch at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Once again, thank you all for watching. My name is Catalyst, and I will see you all another time.